everybody, welcome to another episode of Future Tech. It's me, Charlie Sell, the COO of EMEA for Hydrogen, where I get a chance to talk to technology leaders, thought leaders, people who are passionate about not only STEM careers, but also the careers that they've followed and the lessons that they've learned along the way. As always, it's supported by the STEM Ambassador Association, and it's live on our Hydrogen website as a Future Tech series. So I'm really, really pleased to have Linda Holmes with me today. We've just been having a great chat about not only her background, but also about how passionate she is about supporting diversity and making technology as a sector so much more appealing to young people of all backgrounds, all races, all genders, to be able to feel like they can create careers. And so Linda, who's currently, or has just left actually, as CTO of Garden Financial Services, an insurtech business that has to balance working within a very, very traditional industry with embracing latest technology. There will no doubt be lessons learned about how we break down these barriers and how technology as a whole should be appealing. So without further ado, Linda, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. And I must say, Charlie, I think this is a fantastic initiative. I think it's great that you're providing support to young people looking to embark on STEM careers, and I'm very excited to be part of it. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. So let's jump straight in and tell us about your story. How did you get into technology and a bit of the career?
So I thought a little bit about this, and I thought, I'm at the more towards the back end of my career, and I hope that the things I have to say are still relevant for young people coming into the industry today, because things have changed quite a bit since my day. So what I've tried to do is cover, as I go through my career, cover some of the areas that help me and that might help other people. So I've always been driven by a couple of things. Firstly, I enjoy being outside of my comfort zone. And I've always been intrigued by tech as an enabler. And that was something that developed throughout my course. But I'll start with an anecdote around, and I'm currently, as you said, CTO of an insurtech. But I'll start with an anecdote where a few years ago, about 11, 12 years ago, I was at a graduation ceremony for MBAs. And one of the Rothschild's bankers was giving a talk. And the point he made was, I used to think that what do you want to do in 10 years' time was a good interview question. But I've completely changed my mind, because if I look what I did 10 years ago and where I am now, I would never have put myself in this place. And that really applies to me, because I started my first job was teaching English in Japan, and I've ended up as a tech. So it's a very circuitous route. But I think that's the way that careers go now. So my first piece of advice is, if you have a plan, great. If you don't have a plan, great, because things will crop up. You'll meet people. There'll be opportunities that might not be what you initially had in mind, but somewhere along the way, you'll forge your career path. And I've always been driven by different things at different places. So starting off in Japan, I went to Japan straight out of university. I studied languages at university. I did do a computer language when I was at university, because I was really intrigued by tech then, even though I was a linguist. And I found that even though it was, as a linguist, it wasn't that big a jump to look at a computing language. It's very different. It's very structured very differently. But if there are any linguists out there, there are careers in tech that are waiting for you. So my first job was in Japan, and I went there because I wanted to be outside of my comfort zone, and Japan was about as far afield as I could get. But crucially, I wanted to be able to understand another culture. I wanted to be able to understand how another culture operated. If you have the opportunity to live abroad and at any time in your career, do, because having empathy and being able to look at the world through a different lens is really important. And what I learned in Japan was not just about being able to understand the Japanese culture, but looking back at my own culture through Japanese eyes, which was a real eye-opener. So for me, that was a fantastic start to my career. I really wanted to live and study abroad. The program still exists, I think. It's called the JET program. So if you have that opportunity, do, but I appreciate it's not for everybody. So when I came back, initially I wanted to be a journalist. My father was a journalist. I excelled at English. I enjoyed English. I was in the debating society. I really wanted to be a journalist. And I got my first job via my network, because I'd met a journalist in Japan who I taught him, his wife, and his children English before they were posted to London to work in a company called the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, which is Nikkei. Ironically, I bought the FT. And I got back, I didn't have anything to do, and I talked to him, and he provided me a job in Nikkei. So the first rule is your network, the importance of having a network. And I met somebody at a conference last week, and they talked about how can I really use my network, and how can I get going? The beauty of graduating today is that you have a ready-made network. You've got networks through school, you've got networks through university, WhatsApp groups, Instagram, and we had none of that. We had to kind of retrofit our network. But you already have a really valuable source if you have a network and you stay in contact with it. But I think what's important is you have to leverage it effectively. And so the next lesson I learned is don't be afraid to ask. And there's a fantastic story by Steve Jobs, and he tells a story how he was 12 years old and he called up the CEO of Hewlett Packard. In those days, you could look up the number in the telephone directory, because he wanted some spare parts for a frequency counter. And sure enough, CEO of Hewlett Packard, not only did he get spare parts, he got an internship in the summer holidays. And the point he makes was always ask. If you don't ask, the answer is always no. So don't be afraid to ask. And he said that during his career, he'd asked for numerous favors on numerous occasions, and most people helped. So don't be afraid to use that network and ask for help. My son often will ask me for favors for his friends who are looking for careers in tech. I'd be delighted to help at any point. So the good news is you already have a really good network. What I'd also say is invest in it, in terms of do things for people without necessarily being asked. If somebody asks you a favor, you may not get one in return, and that's fine. You need to do it unconditionally. So I spend a lot of time helping people that I may not ever hear from again, but it doesn't matter, because at due course something may come up. They may I may ask them a favor, I may not. But your network is really, really valuable, and asking things is very valuable. So I worked for Nikkei for about a year, and then I applied for a job in a company that few people had heard of at the time, called CNN. And they had a joint venture with the FT. And because the FT was the equivalent of Nikkei, that was basically my in. And I got a job as a production assistant. And I thought, I'd landed my dream job. And I had a wonderful few years working for CNN. And another thing I learned there is that skills are transferable. So when I was working for CNN, I worked in news, and I would run around Europe interviewing CEOs of companies and putting programs together. And I learned the concept of agile in a newsroom. And we'd sit there in the morning, and we'd have a TV program that we had to put out at 7:00 that night. So we'd have a running order, we'd have a plan, we'd have headlines, we'd do all this. And then during the day, we'd shape it as things changed. Occasionally, you get a major breaking news story, at which point the whole newsroom would stop, everybody would look around, and somebody would jump in and say, right, I'm going to go and do this interview over here. Somebody else would jump in and say, I think there's a really good side angle here. I'll go and have a look at this. Somebody else would say, this needs graphics. Somebody else might say, I need some footage. So nobody ever told them what to do. They just got on and did it. Now, the option is you just stick with the same program that you've got that morning, but then it wouldn't be news, it would be old, right? So you have to adapt, you have to change, adapt for external circumstances. But I learned the whole concept of self-managing teams through news. So when I got into software, it's like, well, of course you do it like that. How would you do it differently? So that was a really good learning experience. Don't be afraid. The skills that you learn are often transferable into industries that you'd never even thought about. So I did that for about a few years, and then I realized that actually journalism was not for me. I didn't have that passion, that burning passion to be in news that I knew some of my colleagues did. But I was fascinated by the businesses that I was writing about, and how they worked, and how you managed businesses, and how you made stuff and did stuff. I really found that interesting. The internet was coming, so I knew that was going to change the dynamics of journalism anyway. So I went and did an MBA at a place called INSEAD. Now, these days, I don't think you need to do that, how would I say, that major a change if you want to shift your career. Back then, it was difficult to really radically shift your career. So it worked for me. It's not for everybody. But it was a really good baptism of fire. You know, I was with people who'd done business and worked in business and consulting. I'd done none of this. I'd been a journalist. And it was a fantastic learning experience to understand how business really worked and how it all fitted together. And I loved it. And I thought, right, this is for me. So when I graduated, I thought, here I am, newly minted MBA. Everybody's going to want to hire me. And nobody did, because they didn't care about the MBA. They cared about the experience. So I thought, right, what am I going to do now? So I actually, again, through the network, went back into journalism, but I went to a company called Reuters, who at that time were beaming news bulletins directly into trading rooms, which at the time was really cutting edge technology. So it was short bursts of programming in a channel. Anytime you wanted, would go into the newsrooms of Barclays, the big investment banks, yada, yada. And I thought this was fantastic. So that's when I really started to link the business and the tech. And I did that for a while, really enjoyed it. And then I was in the street one day and I bumped into one of my colleagues from INSEAD, somebody I knew from INSEAD. And he said, I've got this business that I've set up. And it was basically investor relations, beaming investor relations presentations from major corporations into fund managers across the UK. And he'd got something like 30% of the FTSE at that point. And I thought, that sounds really interesting. I should come and join you. I meant it half jokingly, but I did. So I ended up leaving a big, mature organization, which is a fantastic company to work for, safe job. And I joined the dot-com boom, and I got on the whole dot-com bandwagon. And I ended up in sales. I'd never done sales before. And my job was to set up the business from scratch in Europe. So they had a business in the UK, and I had set up in Europe. And I had a desk and a telephone, and they just said, off you go. So again, I asked lots of favors. I asked around to advice in terms of how I should approach it. But what I learned is just because you've never done it before doesn't mean you can't do it. Pioneering it's a lot of fun. I really, really enjoyed it. And that's when I really became very enmeshed in the tech, because when I was selling the proposition, I had to understand how the technology worked. So I really worked closely with some of the engineer. I learned about video streaming, algorithms, never in the depth that they knew, but I knew it enough to be able to tell a compelling story, because sales is that, just telling a compelling story. And I got business across the whole of Europe. So I had clients in the Nordics, France, Spain, Italy, Germany. I hired people, put in a network, had to set up offices. I had to learn about, how you set up infrastructure across the whole of Europe. Hired production companies, that played to my TV background. So I had production companies who could do some of the filming. And I did that for about 3 or 4 years and had a fantastic time. But that really got me into tech and how tech worked. Raw was then acquired by a company called Thomson Financial. And Thomson Financial is a fantastic company. They saw the internet coming. And they were at that stage, this is in the 90s, they were in newspapers and travel, 2 industries that they knew would be severely disrupted by the internet. So they sold them long before the disruption came, and they started to reinvent themselves in different verticals. One of them in financial services, other was legal, education, by hoovering up all these dot-coms. So it was literally like working for a $2 billion startup. And I went with the acquisition, and I got asked if I could run they'd done a couple of acquisitions in the same space. And I got asked if I'd run the streaming media version. At that point, they were selling their services into companies, banks, institutions all across the world. Mine was in EMEA. And I was in what they call the corporate division. So I started there. It was a very, very diverse company, both in terms of cultures. There were lots of people from different cultures. I love going to the ladies' toilets, and there'd be about 8 languages being spoken, lots of different nationalities. They were very good with women. So I got promoted to be the head of the division on maternity leave. You don't find that happening very often. The head of the division itself was in 3 different areas in leading edge tech of its day. So it was streaming media, but also software as a service, very early software as a service, and very early data. So again, I had to expand my knowledge of the tech to make the business successful. And my job was to grow the business. So that's, the sales experience came in. But more and more, I had to understand how the product and the sales work together to be able to really drive the business effectively. And the tech teams and the businesses work really closely. That's when I started to get involved in Agile proper for the first time. And I saw some projects that would be, there was one project we had, which was we had to build a system to compare shareholder registers for major companies. So compare massive swathes of data. And I learned the hard way that you really need to get the business and tech working together, because the end result came, it was classic waterfall, and it was nothing like what the business wanted. So I argued successfully to get some of the developers who were based in India. I brought them over to the UK and I made them sit next to the people who they were supplying the service for, so they could understand how they worked. And that's when you realize that tech for tech, it's not about tech for tech's sake. It's how it impacts the business and how it makes the business effective. So I really got into the whole Agile movement very early on in terms of how that all operated. And then merged with, Thomson Financial merged with Reuters. So I was back full circle to Reuters again. And I managed the combined business across Europe. So I'd basically gone from the days of raw, of just sitting there with practically nothing, to managing this business to 5, 10, 50, about 150 million by the end, and managing at different steps of the way, learning different things as I went along. And it really helped me immerse myself into how tech can be really effective in businesses. Very early, it's very early days when I was doing it. But now, it's all standard stuff. But then it was groundbreaking. But it was a fantastic ride. I left the company after about 10 years because Thomson Financial, as it was then, Thomson Reuters sold the business to NASDAQ. And NASDAQ didn't have a regional structure. I headed up Europe. NASDAQ didn't have a regional structure. They had a product structure, which is standard. Companies go back and forth between the two. And I was offered a global role, but I chose not to take it because at that time I had children. My children were of an age where I wanted to be at home more, and it would have meant an insane amount of travel. And I'd been traveling wildly for 14, 15 years, and I needed a bit of a break. So I thought, right, what do I want to do next? So I decided I'd leave NASDAQ. I did a handover, and I thought, well, what do I want to do next when I grow up? So I started casting around, and I looked at similar roles. There were similar companies to Thomson at the time, Thomson Reuters at the time, and I looked at those. But actually, I ended up in a completely different industry. Again, it's like being outside my comfort zone, because I ended up in insurance. And I ended up in insurance because a friend of mine had said to me, I've got this little business. I'm not sure how to run it. Can you come and help me try and sort it out? And it meant a couple of things. First of all, I was outside of my comfort zone again, which I quite enjoyed. It was a brand new industry, but it was an industry that was ripe for disruption. And having worked in industries that I'd seen being disrupted, that appealed to me. It also meant I could stay in the UK. I didn't have to travel as much. So, and if you'd have said to me, 10 years previously, you'll end up in life insurance, I would have said, no, not in a million years. But there I was in life insurance. And it was a very high-end broker doing very high-end deals, largely for real estate, estate planning, estate management. But I was working with the big four accountancy firms, law firms, etc. And what I had to do there was they were completely analog. There was nothing digital about it at all. They had a back office up in Blackpool, main office was in Gloucestershire. There was an underwriter who sat in Essex, and it was all email and paper, and there were big cases written up on whiteboards in an office. So I literally had to digitize it from scratch. So I didn't know anything about the industry, but I put in a system that allowed everybody to talk to each other effectively, allowed us to manage all the cases. And we went from being able to manage about 10 or 15 cases, these are big £100 million cases simultaneously, to about 50 with the same team. So I was able to massively scale the business. But it was really difficult culturally. That was the first time I'd experienced that culturally it was very different from what I was used to, in terms of the insurance industry was not quite as diverse. And I think, that was the first time I came across real misogyny. And had I been younger, I would have found that very difficult. But because I was a bit older by then, I wasn't having any of it. I wasn't standing for any of this. So I did that for about 4 years, and the business grew really successfully, did very well. But it got to the stage where it wasn't going to grow very fast, and I'd done what I could, and I needed to think about something else. And I wasn't really looking, but I was approached by somebody who worked in an insurance company, so not from a broking side, but the insurance company. And they said, we need a CO. Would you come and join as interim COO? And I thought, well, this looks interesting. It was an insurtech. And the company was really interested in challenging the status quo in insurance and thought there was a much better way of doing this. So that also appealed. So I joined as COO, did that for 6 months, had to launch a product, which I didn't really understand very much about, but I'd done new stuff in the past, so I wasn't afraid of doing it again, use my network, asked lots of questions. I launched that in about 6 months. And then they said to me after that, would you be CTO? And I said, well, I've never been a CTO. I don't know whether I could be a CTO. And they said, you'll figure it out. So I became the CTO, and I did figure it out. And I realized that there's a few things. Firstly, communication is key. Being able to communicate effectively in tech is really important. And it's really difficult for some people in tech to do that. It took me a while to realize. I'd sit in meetings and I'd say I didn't really understand what had been said. So I'd say to one of my colleagues, can you explain what this person was talking about? I said, I have no idea. I said, what do you mean you've no idea? He said, well, we don't, nobody really understands what he said. Well, why don't you ask him? People didn't like to feel stupid in front of their peers. So it's all about communication, prioritization. You need to prioritize effectively, and you need to be able to explain it to the business. And you need the tech and the business teams to work together collaboratively to make sure the solution is fit for purpose. And it's not even about the business requirements, it's about business outcomes. Sometimes the business would come with requirements that actually was not going to deliver the outcomes that they actually needed or thought they would get to. So if we sat down and understood at the beginning, well, what do you need to achieve and what are you trying to get to? It made it much easier to design a solution. And sometimes the solution was not tech. Sometimes the solution was, well, actually, given the number of clients that this is going to apply to, why don't you just hire 3 people? It'll be a lot cheaper, and then we'll build a tech solution in a year's time. Sometimes it's not always about a technical solution. So I did that for 5 years. I learned a hell of a lot. It was a very steep learning curve, but I read voraciously. I've always read around the subject. My coding background really helped because I wasn't fazed by the code, even though it'd come a long way from when I'd been, when I'd written my small programs at uni. It's still the same mentality. I really enjoyed that. And one of the first jobs I had to do was actually, they'd launched with a platform which was fit for purpose when they launched, but they were very small. It's a small company. Most small companies work to be acquired by large ones or fill a function for large companies. Guardian competed with very large organizations, but you couldn't build the kind of network and infrastructure that they had on day one. You had to start small. So they started with a platform which was great to get to market, but very quickly it became clear, because they experienced rapid growth, that they needed something different. So I had to, with no prior experience, take out the back end and put in a complete new business journey, a new underwriting rules engine, and work with the business and the teams to make that happen. And again, through my business knowledge, that was really useful in and project management and all the skills I'd learned at Thomson Reuters. That really helped me to achieve those end goals. And so that's where I ended up. So that's a bit of a canter through.
That is, you know what, Linda, that was such a fascinating career history, because what the takeaways I took from that was just that variety of job roles you had, especially in your early careers, that have given you foundations into the following career. As you said, the skills you learn from sales to producing, from even from German and language. has made you the fulfilled sort of CTO. You brought that to the Guardian in that entire capacity, and you were able to then turn your hand to a huge program or a huge project, even if you didn't have all of the expertise to do that. You drew on everything that you could bring into it, and and hopefully with people listening to this podcast, when they're thinking to themselves, have I, I've started a career, is this the right one for me? What I hear from you is, if you have a plan, great. If you don't have a plan, great, as you said at the beginning, and don't be afraid to try different things.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that, it's your network, it's acquaintances, it's chance meetings, it's you
Yeah,
come to certain career crossroads at points in your life and you have decisions to make. And sometimes there are multiple choices. But I
yeah,
think the more that you gain confidence, the more you do, the more experience you have, you gain the confidence. But it's been quite a ride. I've quite enjoyed it.
yeah. And like all things, when I have the people on my podcast who are just so engaging and passionate, time absolutely flies by from us. So we've scooted through and we've covered loads about the life lessons of entering a career. But so really now the bit that we that's so important to cover for many of the young people is that career advice.
Yeah.
What's those one or two bits of career advice you would give a young person when they are trying to get their foot in the door?
I'd say, some of these I've touched on. So definitely use your network and don't be afraid to ask.
Yeah,
Don't be afraid of rejection or career setbacks. Everybody's had rejection at some point, but it's how you then carry on and pick yourself up and move forward that will help you in the longer term. Ask for advice while you're in the role. Don't be worried about not knowing anything, because you can always, nobody knows everything. And I think particularly in tech these days, it's developing so fast. It's developing faster than people can really learn about it. So nobody knows everything. If you've read two more articles than the next person, you're the expert. Just never stop learning. And I think the generation of people now, my generation, I think we didn't have all of the tools out there. YouTube is a fantastic place for learning new skills. There are courses online. Never stop learning, because the jobs that you probably will be doing in 10 years' time may not even exist yet. So always keep learning as you go along. The other thing that I learned as well is that it's really getting your foot in the door. It's really important once you've got that if you get the interview, if you get to the interview stage, it's really important to make a good impression at the interview. I think in another podcast, I looked at the fact that a lot of people don't always interview that well. So when you're looking for a role, I would say, first of all, research the company that you're going to really well. Make sure that you really understand it. Look at the job spec and look at how your skills or what you've done either at school or university, and people won't have expected you to have done a lot at that stage. It's fine, but any clubs you've been in, anything extracurricular, it all counts. It's all really helpful. And look at how your skills match that the job description, and make sure that they go away knowing that you can do X, Y, and Z because you've given them examples of what you've done. I think it's evidence-based. This is the problem, this is how I solved it, and this is what I did to get there. Often three things that match the job description. And that will help you. You can control the interview that way. That will help you in terms
yeah,
of how you get your message across.
yeah. Well, thank you. Really, really, really good insights there, and I think some really, really relevant advice. So, well, Linda, that has flown by. What a great podcast. And so thank you so much. There's so much more we could cover. And actually, you know what? I'd love to maybe do a follow-up podcast with you, because we didn't even get a chance to touch on some of the other topics that we're equally passionate about, because your career story is just fascinating. So for me, a massive thank you for being on our podcast.
It's a pleasure, an absolute pleasure. And I'm always happy to do follow-ups. I'm very passionate about, we've touched on this before, about women in technology.
Yes.
When I
Yeah.
first started at Thomson, I was often the only woman in the room, but that changed as my career
Yeah.
developed. That changed. I'm surprised how often I go to events and I'm the only woman, and it does feel different. And I do
Yeah.
think that any organization, benefits from diversity. I've seen that so many times in my career, not just whether you have women, but people from different backgrounds as well. And I'm really passionate about ensuring that more women have opportunities in tech. So this is going to be a little bit of a personal crusade of mine going forward.
Yeah, we discussed it earlier, didn't we? So I absolutely think that's something we should actually spend a dedicated time on, because these podcasts always enthrall me when someone is so passionate about the subject matter. So yeah, thank you to Linda, and
Pleasure.
to our listeners. That is another episode of our Future Tech podcast. As many of you know, it's shared with the STEM ambassadors. It's also on the Hydrogen Group website. And so everyone, thank you for listening. And that's another episode of Future Tech.